Just read a terrific post on X that they want deportations to continue till you no longer have to press 1 for English. So I like the new movie The Apprentice about Donald Trump's early days and how Roy Cohn was a key mentor. And among the news media descriptions of the film, you see that it contains a shocking rape sequence. Well, the quote-unquote rape sequence is between Donald Trump and his wife, and it occurs in a context where she is trying to seduce him, right? And he waves her off, says he's not interested anymore, and then she gets mad, and then he forces himself on her sexually. So traditionally, there's no such concept as marital rape, because if a wife was being raped, you'd expect that she'd just leave her husband. So I think it's a vast overstatement to call that scene rape. Right? You might be able to call it unwanted sex, but it occurs within the context of Donald Trump's wife is trying to seduce him. Then he blows her off, she blows him off, and then he takes her. So the big news this morning on the left is that the Morning Joe hosts, Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski, went to Mar-a-Lago on Friday and met with Donald Trump. And they're trying to reestablish lines of communication. So they hadn't spoken with Trump since March of 2020, with the exception of a phone call that Joe Scarborough made to Donald Trump after the assassination attempt in Pennsylvania. So I watched Morning Joe for the first time in weeks, months, this morning, and they seem to be inching towards a new tone. Right? MSNBC has lost a significant amount of its viewership. Right? This is completely different from the 2016 situation when viewership and subscriptions to left-leaning outlets soared as the resistance soared. Now you see liberals, by and large, muting themselves, tuning out from politics, focusing on other things in their life. And so I haven't seen yet on MSNBC any movement to get more Trump-friendly voices on the air. But they had John Meacham on there. John Meacham on the day of the election said that if Donald Trump was elected, right, you might not have historians being allowed to write history books anymore, which seems like a ridiculous overstatement. John Meacham condemns nationalism, because supposedly nationalism is all about loyalty to people who look like you, and said, once again today, he made the case for patriotism. Patriotism is loyalty to an idea. Right, John Meacham's an intellectual. He writes history books. And for John Meacham, the peak form of political expression is loyalty to an idea. That's just not how the world works. Right? People are not primarily motivated by loyalty to ideas. They're primarily motivated by loyalty to their family, to their extended family. And the nation is the largest political unit that can be considered your extended family. So there was a Clint Eastwood movie, something about the invasion of Iwo Jima from the American side. Oh, Flags of Our Fathers, that's what it was called. And they made the point that the protagonists in the movie, they weren't fighting for an idea. They weren't even fighting for the United States. They were fighting for each other. Right? We're primarily motivated, driven, impelled, compelled by the people around us, the people that we're closest to, family, extended family, friends. The more similarities we have with people, the more likely we are to bond. And the more diverse our community, the less likely we are to have things in common with each other, which means the less likely we are to sacrifice for each other, and the less likely we are to want to spend time with each other. So encouraging signs from Morning Joe that is returning to a saner, more centrist approach, but only minimum progress shown. David Ignatius is a regular guest on Morning Joe. He's like a voice of the deep state. Fair-minded, right? He will praise Trump for things, criticize Trump for things, but he's very much the voice of the establishment. Right? He has great sources in the Defense Department. Now, what blew my mind over the weekend was seeing Sean Spicer's interview with Steve Bannon and seeing some Steve Bannon clips. And if you want to get excited about Trump's most controversial cabinet picks, then I can think of no better way to do that than to watch the Sean Spicer interview with Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon makes the most compelling case that I've heard yet for Trump's nominations of Pete Hegseth for Secretary of Defense, Matt Gaetz for Attorney General, Bobby Kennedy for Health and Human Services, Tulsi Gabbard for Director of National Intelligence, and Kristi Noem for Department of Homeland Security. He says these are the people that Trump needs to clean out from the deep state those who are opposed to him, to declassify documents, to open up information on what's been happening the last few years as the deep state's gone after Donald Trump. And I'll admit, right, I think that Trump's nominations of Hegseth, Gaetz, and Kennedy are absurd. I think they're terrible picks. But listening to Steve Bannon, it was easy to become convinced that they were great picks. And I don't like the picks, but I found myself, as I was listening to Steve Bannon speak, maybe these are good picks, right? Maybe Trump knows what he's doing. Maybe this will work out. Maybe this is the right thing to do. This is the first time that I even seriously considered that. So the problem is Steve Bannon is not trustworthy. He just pours out a ton of rhetoric, and he doesn't feel the need to optimize for truth. Right? He optimizes for action. He optimizes for getting results. He's a subversive, right? He's a political activist. So he optimizes for activism. So I tried watching War Room in the aftermath of the 2020 election, and it was just so bad. There was just so little fidelity to truth and facts on that show. I gave up. I just became disgusted with it. But maybe I should give it another try this time round. And Steve Bannon is worth listening to, right? He ran Donald Trump's winning campaign in 2016. He's got a lot of smart ideas about nationalism, about bringing the deep state and the bureaucracy under control. And heck, maybe Steve Bannon is right that Donald Trump's picks are the right picks. But on the other hand, I know that Steve Bannon has a philosophy that you just shovel a lot of shit out there. You just cover your opponents in feces. That's his political activism framework. And so he's not a reliable narrator. He's like Tucker Carlson, right? Hits it out of the park sometimes and then just says absurd things the next minute. Like 1 minute brave truth teller, next minute just peddling the most absurd lies. Now, Steve Bannon served 4 months in prison because he defied a congressional subpoena. And when I listened to him talk about that, right, I felt like, he was brave. He was standing up to the forces of darkness and corruption. And then I get swept away by the emotions that Steve Bannon brings up. And then I step back away from my emotions and think, hey, all this guy had to do was to submit to a congressional subpoena, show up, testify before the January 6th Commission. Right? He doesn't have a right to just ignore that subpoena. On the other hand, he was sent to prison, all right, for a misdemeanor, which is very rare. How often do people get sent to prison for a misdemeanor? That virtually never happens. So you can make a good case that this was lawfare. This is judicial and political overreach of punishing your opponents. I would have been more enthused about Steve Bannon's comments if his track record after Trump's 2020 election defeat wasn't so terrible, and how he's on board with anti-vaccination narratives, which I consider ludicrous. The single easiest thing that you can do for your health is to take the doctor-recommended vaccinations. Then on the other hand, you have an absurd New York Times article supposedly picking apart Bobby Kennedy's lies, and the evidence it uses, one of the points that it uses is that Bobby Kennedy said that Fruit Loops are different in Canada than in the United States, and then the New York Times says no, they're identical, except that Canada uses natural food dyes, while in America they use all these various chemical dyes. Now, I don't think there's any evidence that these chemical dyes are harmful. But to the crunchy granola type, right, that is a red flag. They don't like their chemicals. They want everything natural. So Michael Beckley has a new video out talking about the fall of China. So I remember when I was live streaming in 2018, 2019, there was a lot of conversation about the rise of China and how China was going to outcompete the United States. I just never hear that anymore. Almost never hear that, because the brutal fact is China isn't rising even by its own statistics. And when you track empirical, objective data against what the Chinese government claims about its economy, it's clear that Chinese government statistics are overstated by at least 20%. And what is clear objective data? Just look at electricity use at night across various regions of China. And so even going by Chinese government statistics, which are overstated in China's favor, right? China's economy has dramatically slowed in economic growth, that it's experiencing a population decrease. It's going to have a stunning drop. So over the past 20 years, there have been something like 15 workers in China for every one retired person. But in the next few years, there will be 2 Chinese workers for every one retired person. So China's in economic decline. And great powers in economic decline often make risky choices and go to war. So you use the example of the United States in the 1890s, because during the 1880s, the US had these terrible economic downturns and depressions. And so the United States expanded out in the 1890s, conquering territory in the Caribbean, Philippines, and forcing trade deals on large parts of Latin America to try to get the American economy going again. And he gave very convincing examples from history of declining great powers going to war to try to rescue their economy. And so he says that China will be particularly dangerous, peaking about 5 years from now. with its threats to overtake Taiwan and to expand into the South China Sea and to force trade deals on more and more of its neighbors using military force if necessary. So Michael Beckley wrote a great paper in 2016, published a great paper in 2016 about how China's rise was greatly exaggerated. China's had productivity declines for many, many years. Right, it has to use more and more inputs of capital for every output. Right, the Chinese economy is becoming less efficient, less productive. And he nailed it back in a 2016 paper that he turned into a 2018 book. And he came out with a second book, largely focused on Taiwan. So he's been consistently ahead of the curve about how the rise of China is vastly exaggerated. Now, Peter Zeihan has been predicting the collapse of China for 20 years. Right, back in 2004, he was predicting that China would collapse in the next 10 years. And he's still holding to a prediction that China will collapse in the next 10 years. Just he's been making this prediction for 20 years now. He also predicted there's no way that Donald Trump would be elected this time around. He was wrong about that. I just heard him commenting that Donald Trump has lost it. He's just descended into some kind of mental fog. I don't think Donald Trump has quite lost it yet. Right? Donald Trump has many family members, uncles, who lived a long time and had long, productive lives. So there's not strong evidence that Donald Trump is in anything like the steep mental decline and senility that we saw exhibited by Joe Biden over the last 7 years. But Peter Zeihan was labeling him as suffering from dementia and wondering who would really rule. Would it be J.D. Vance? Now, I was watching Two-Way this morning with Mark Halperin, and the gang on Two-Way, they all predicted that most of Trump's controversial nominees would get through, including Matt Gaetz. Right, the one in most trouble, they suggested, was Pete Hegseth. And this is if there are no more damaging revelations about Hegseth, Kennedy, and Gaetz. So the Two-Way crew of Mark Halperin, Sean Spicer, Dan Turrentine have a different, far more optimistic perspective on the likelihood of Trump's cabinet nominees getting approved by the U.S. Senate compared to the mainstream media. Halperin said that when the mainstream media sees a nominee getting into trouble, right, they expect it will just be an inevitable decline into withdrawal or rejection. So it could be that Two-Way is ahead of the curve on Trump's nominees as they were about the 2024 election results. Or maybe this time the mainstream media will be correct and Two-Way will have been out of touch. But it's striking the difference in tone between Two-Way and the mainstream media with regard to Trump's cabinet picks. Halperin talked a lot about Republican Senator body language, particularly John Thune, the Senate Majority Leader, soon to be Senate Majority Leader. His body language didn't show him as terribly enthused about Donald Trump's more controversial cabinet picks, didn't depict him as someone who was eager to go to battle for Trump's most controversial picks. Many Republican senators display body language that shows that they're not too thrilled with Matt Gaetz, Pete Hegseth, Bobby Kennedy. And speaking of body language, a significant component of how Donald Trump chooses his cabinet is by watching video of them appearing on TV, often with the sound off, just to check to see if they look authoritative, compelling, strong. And that was the process that Roger Ailes would use when determining if someone was cut out for being a TV host. He'd watch them on TV with the sound off, and he'd just check to see if they held his attention. If they held his attention with the sound off, he thought, this is likely a winner. And it's not an absurd way to choose a cabinet. It's absurd if it's the only criteria. It's absurd if you are 100% committed to the idea that physiognomy is destiny. But physiognomy is a powerful indicator of a person's personality, character. And Trump judges people by their physiognomy and by their appearance, by their clothes, by their body language, by their looks, far more than any American president that I can think of. But it's not a completely absurd perspective. Right? All these things are important. Just as I'm particularly attuned to the way people speak and to the quality of their voice. Right? I listen to someone's voice and I can hear if they are decisive, if they have clarity, if they have strength, if they're equivocating, if they're being deceptive. The quality of someone's voice is a powerful indicator to me. But physiognomy, appearance, presentation, right, they matter. It's not absurd that Trump uses them. It's absurd if Trump uses that criteria above all other possible criteria. I can't believe I'm about to start listening to the War Room again and Steve Bannon. But he still talks to Donald Trump, right? He still has Trump's ear. Trump still turns to him for advice. Trump spoke to him shortly after Steve Bannon got out of prison. Right, Steve Bannon won an unprecedented 2016 electoral victory for Donald Trump, so certainly knows some things. So I read in the chastened, humbled, bending over backwards to be fair and objective now news media account of Donald Trump's cabinet picks. And there's great focus on how Trump's cabinet picks are a threat to American institutions. As if America receives undiluted benefit from our institutions, as if America is just unequivocally benefited by all of our institutions. And it's possible to me that the United States might be better off if some of our institutions declined in power. Certainly don't want to burn up and destroy all of our institutions. But there might be an agency here, a government department there, an institution here and there where America would benefit from the decline in that institution, that agency's power. That doesn't seem completely absurd to me. It's not like all institutions just maintaining and expanding their power is ipso facto a good thing. Just like ipso facto, it's not necessarily a good thing if our institutions decline in power. It depends on which institution and how much decline. What does that decline in power and influence mean? So there are sexual assault allegations against Matt Gaetz and Pete Hegseth. These are sexual assault allegations where women didn't bring rape charges. Right, so it's not exactly compelling. Now, it depends on how much independent evidence they bring, but if they did not think that what happened to them was worthy of a criminal charge of rape, or if they tried to bring that charge and law enforcement found that there was not enough evidence, then these stories, are these allegations worth ruining Matt Gaetz and Pete Hegseth over? Right? It's a lot more convincing if you got someone convicted in a court of law rather than just various women bringing allegations. And it's almost always women who voluntarily, went back to the man's room. Right? And you know what that means. Right? Usually if a woman goes to a man's hotel room, goes to his apartment, goes to his home, she is indicating a willingness to have sex. There's another trope that I find lacking in truth, in that for much of the punditry, it's just taken for granted that the United States is in decline. Well, we don't have strong evidence that the United States is in decline. In fact, all the empirical evidence shows that America is still expanding its power vis-a-vis the other great powers. 20 years ago, the United States and Europe had about equal size economies. Now the American economy is 50% bigger. Right, the American economy is thriving compared to Europe, to China, to Japan, to Russia. So the overwhelming empirical objective evidence is the United States is in a period of expanding power vis-a-vis the rest of the world, not declining. The United States is taking up a higher percentage of the world's gross domestic product than it did 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago. Been looking at Matt Drudge since the election. He appears a lot saner. Right? He's got almost nothing about Trump on his homepage. He appears to have shifted towards the political center. So news media coverage has moved much more towards the center, towards more objectivity, towards more fairness, compared to the hysterical anti-Trump, Trump is a fascist tone of coverage that dominated in the lead up to the 2024 election. I am loving all these clips of professional athletes and other people imitating Donald Trump's dance. I mean, it's hilarious. It's a viral clip after viral clip of people doing the Trump dance to YMCA. And evidence of a vibe shift in American culture. So John Jones, after his UFC victory Saturday night, immediately did the Trump dance, went over to Trump, was embraced by Trump. NFL players are doing the Trump dance after a sack, after a touchdown. I see it drives a lot of liberals crazy on social media. They want these dances outlawed. Right, we're not just intellectual beings, we're also physical beings. And imitating the Trump dance, right, is a way to make this moment visceral and physical. It's a glorious thing. So, Steve Bannon says that he wants Matt Gaetz to go in there, just get rid of the attorneys in the Justice Department who've been corrupting our political system and pursuing lawfare. Steve Bannon says he'd like the shutdown of the FBI and its replacement with a new federal law enforcement agency. Okay, I think that Steve Bannon's perspective is ridiculous. But when you listen to him, right, he's very convincing. right? He has a passion and an ability to connect that if you're predisposed to a MAGA worldview, it's easy to be swayed by Steve Bannon. When he was in prison for 4 months, right, the ratings on his War Room podcast just crashed. Right, it was steadily among the top 10 podcasts. Then it just crashed. He wasn't easy to replace. Apparently his daughter was running the show from behind the scenes while he was gone. Now he's moved the podcast back to the highest rankings. The Trump team seems to be taking a serious look at a different way of engaging with the news media, right? Spending more time with independent podcasts and giving less attention to the networks, to CNN, to the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times. Should be a significant vibe shift. Talk to you guys later. Bye-bye. Wait, what's going on? Cost of labor is skyrocketing in China. Please repent for your sinful lifestyle. What's sinful about my lifestyle? Catastrophic predictions often fall prey to moving goalposts. So, to prepare for the show tonight, check out the Sean Spicer interview with Steve Bannon. Check out some of the latest War Room, Steve Bannon War Room podcasts. Send me timestamps, links if you think any are worthy of discussion. Because after the 2020 election, Steve Bannon's War Room just seemed way out of touch with reality. Perhaps he is more in touch with reality, along with the overall Trump campaign, in that Trump won decisively. So maybe Steve Bannon and his show have vastly improved. And it's worth checking out the Michael Beckley video presentations on the decline of China and how that threatens to lead to more wars, more conflict, particularly in the South Pacific and around Taiwan. Haven't talked about China very much in 2024. Like in 2018, it was almost taken for granted that China was on the rise and America was on the decline. And I was arguing the opposite of that conventional wisdom, day in, day out, show in, show out. And now nobody wants to argue with me that China's on the rise, it's going to crush us. Talk to you guys later. Bye-bye.